Good evening, good afternoon. Could I please ask you to take your seats, because we are under an immense time pressure, and that befits with the subject of the afternoon, the Iranian issue, the looming crisis, and are there any possible solutions. I have to tell you, this is really the very last moment of a 2.5-day private meeting which the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination has arranged for in the last days, from Saturday really till today. And I simply felt it would be unjust to the university community. Of course, I'm painfully aware that it's Monday afternoon and that part of my colleagues have classes and there are other events today, like a town meeting, but I thought we have these eminent experts with us today, and we had them here since 2 days, and I thought it would be befitting to offer, at least to those who could come and are interested in, some of their ideas for the discussion about Iran. My name is Wolfgang Danspeckgruber. As many of you know, I run the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination, and our institute has been involved in the Iran crisis as in the Afghan crisis since actually 2000 and 2003 respectively. I'm delighted that we have with us today Professor Ali Ansari, from St. Andrews University, where he not only teaches Iranian affairs in the School of History, but also, and very importantly, where he has created an eminent Center for Iranian Studies in the last couple of months. Then Madame Gabrielle Rifkind, who is from the Oxford group on negotiations, and who is actually by training a psychologist and deals with negotiations in crisis situation and second track diplomacy. These two speakers will begin, and because they have an airplane back to London at 7 o'clock. So they will both speak briefly and then take some questions, and then please forgive us when they rush out to catch the plane. The cab is waiting. They will be followed by Sir John Thomson, who may not need much introduction here at Princeton. I dare say, John, an eminent Princetonian, but more eminently so, he has been United Kingdom's ambassador to the United Nations and represented the UK in the United Nations Security Council. And he also has been, and some people forget that, the founder of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is a group very important in nuclear energy. And John Thomson will follow the two speakers and present his ideas in 10-12 minutes, and then take questions, because then he has to go to the airport and fly out.
And then you're left with me.
You're left with
At which point everybody can go home.
then you're left with James Gow and Wolfgang Danspeckgruber and Ambassador Robert Finn. We said we would both take questions, Finn and I, but especially James Gow would present to you strategic perspectives on the Iran crisis. And he holds a chair for strategic studies at King's College in London, and is one of the most important advisors to well, some organizations in England. Now with this, the floor is yours, Professor Ali Ansari. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and it's very nice to be back, and very nice to see so many familiar faces. I have in this 10 minutes to talk a little bit about one aspect of some of the discussions we've been having over the past 2 days, and I'm going to look particularly at the political situation in Iran itself and see what changes have been taking place. I'll just highlight a few points, and obviously welcome any questions that you may be able to get in before I have to rush off and catch this plane. What's been most interesting about the last few months has been the way in which politics has really returned into Iran in the domestic sense. Politics has come alive again. We know that with the election of President Ahmadinejad, and I use that term very loosely, but the election in 2005, that many people considered that the process of democratization or the process of reform in Iran was dead. and that effectively what Ahmadinejad represented was an attempt by hardline conservatives within the country to stamp out what I've called in other places the heresy of reform. And I use that term very deliberately because you could see the way in which this particular group of people, the people who I like to call in some ways Iran's neoconservative movement, basically wanted to, with a full conviction, self-belief and some rather unorthodox religious views, it has to be said, some which even some senior ayatollahs did not necessarily adhere to, Mr. Ahmadinejad sought to transform in many ways the internal political structure of the country away from any concept of Islamic democracy, however which way we want to define that, into a much more autocratic system where essentially an Islamist elite governed and the rest basically came along. And part of this process, basically his policy, if we can call it that, was to apply a heavy dose of economic populism. I wouldn't want to call it a policy because this is really what's undone him, but also tied to a sense of an international crisis, a continued international crisis, which would divert the attention of people inside towards a very noble nationalist cause, which he thought he was defending, while at the same time he would use this nationalist agenda to disguise the fact that on a domestic level, in actual fact, many aspects of what we would consider a sort of national platform were being ignored. Now, what's happened really since summer, and it's been quite dramatic, after the war in Lebanon, when really we could say that Mr. Ahmadinejad was at the crest of a wave and that he was looking rather powerful both at home and abroad, and he could claim to have basically positioned Iran in some ways as the dominant or the sort of regional power, even though, as we've discussed throughout the last 2 days, really that Iran's position in the region has really been as a result of the policies of others, and not really as a result of any proactive activities on the Iranian side. They've reacted rather than been proactive, but nonetheless he took credit for many of the things that were taking place, and Iran certainly looked robust. But there's nothing like success to breed hubris. And of course, Mr. Ahmadinejad decided that he now no longer needed actually his former allies. He'd been busy alienating quite a few of even his hawkish allies in the parliament. And he headed towards 2 elections that were to be held in December in Iran, full of confidence that he would consolidate his dominance of the Iranian political scene by getting an effective electoral mandate. Now, what actually happened was the reverse, and this is quite interesting, because not only in the 2 elections that took place, there was one for an assembly of experts, which is a body, best could be termed as a sort of a college of cardinals. It's there basically to elect the next supreme leader, and given that it's elected the elections are every 8 years, it's very likely that this assembly of experts will have a role in electing the next leader. Not only did he lose mightily in that election, but more critically, he lost quite dramatically in the council elections that took place at the same time. And this was interesting for a number of reasons. One was that the council elections in Iran, like all sort of municipal elections, certainly in the United Kingdom, are generally treated with a certain amount of non-interest by the population. They're not seen as important, clearly, as the presidential or the parliamentary elections. But on this occasion, turnout proved to be quite high. And it proved to be quite high because the pragmatic conservatives, symbolized in many ways by the former President Rafsanjani, and the reformists, symbolized again by former President Khatami, decided to act in union and to prevent a coherent and united front with a single list of candidates. And as a consequence of this, Ahmadinejad failed to secure the control of any of the municipal councils in the country, and more importantly than that, he lost control of Tehran City Council, and that's quite important in terms of the future electoral process in Iran. Now, after that, what was most interesting, apart from these election results, was it then became open season on the president as to his incompetence. And one of the things I want to emphasize is the way in which his own, I think, political and economic mismanagement has basically led to, sowed the seeds of his own problems. I don't want to exaggerate the consequences of this. I don't want to say that we're about to see his imminent fall, although it was very striking that some members of the parliament were voting to have him impeached, which was quite refreshing. But I think it's not going to go quite that far at the moment, but nonetheless we can see that views were turning against him. And I ought to say in this point that a number of other factors, as well as the economy, basically began to work against him. If you have a successful economy, you can get away with quite a bit. But if you don't have a successful economy, other things start to come home to bite you. And among these were his mishandling, as they saw it, of the international nuclear negotiations, but also his rather, shall we say, in polite language, his idiosyncratic views on a range of issues, including the return of the hidden imam, which was meant to be imminent, and also, obviously, his views on the Holocaust. Now, what was interesting about these events is the reaction in Iran. I mean, the reaction in Iran was not at all positive, and it's very interesting. I don't have time to go into these, but if you look at the interviews that were being done, the press criticism, they really took him to task. But I want to go back to this notion of the economy, because the economy is very important in the sense that he had come to power on a platform of economic reform, a sort of a, people called him the Hugo Chavez of Iran, or so they hoped, but I understand also that's not a good thing. But nonetheless, he planned to redistribute the oil wealth and hand it out to people. Now, how he did this was very interesting. He didn't want to go through the traditional organs of government, i.e., maybe a managed increase in salaries. Instead, what he did was he plundered the oil reserve fund that was built up under the Khatami era and handed out cash. And this is why he became popular. It's not very difficult to work this one out. If you hand out cash to poor people, people like you. And what he was doing was he was giving out cash, a month's extra salary, a bonus, so on and so forth. But the consequence of this was that people obviously went to spend it. And when they go and spend this money, they spent it on basic goods. And as he was forewarned, once you spend it on these basic goods, the price of basic goods, funnily enough, goes up. Now, to compound this, he also decided, in a highly populist measure, to have interest rates cut. In so doing, what he did was he ensured that those middle classes who had money within the banking system took their money out, and either also compounded the issue by spending their money or shipping it abroad. So this also weakened the currency. So what you had was a situation where prices were going up, inflation was going up, the real was weakening and money was going abroad, and in addition to this, he had singularly failed to do anything about the unemployment problem. In actual fact, contrary to this, he had announced to the world, to much ridicule in Iran, it has to be said, that Iran, in his view, was underpopulated and people should go off and procreate a bit more. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about Iran's population problem since 1980, the Iranian government had spent a rather sort of almost the Chinese draconian measures of curtailing the population growth, and to have the president suddenly announce that actually, because, and he said this actually, it's quite interesting, he said, because of my government, our resources have not doubled, they have gone up tenfold since I've come into power. We have the resources to support a population double this size. Now, this clearly was not something that people were going to encourage, but it shows something of his mindset and it shows something of his attitude towards economics. And it's this economic problem that is causing him, this economic malaise, which is causing him problem within the country and is the trigger for a lot of his problems at the moment and the opening of politics. It has, I have to say, also probably made the country more vulnerable today to economic sanctions from abroad than it would have been, say, 4 or 5 years ago. And I would argue that on two fronts, Ahmadinejad has been very, very bad news for Iran. I always, we joke a little bit about the way in which countries overseas see him as the bane of all evil. He's actually, in many ways, very good news because he's done a lot of damage to the country. And he's done this on both on a political front, but more particularly on an economic front. So at the moment, politics has opened up in Iran in a way that we haven't seen for probably 18 months. And there is a very, very serious battle going on. But the key question, I think Gabrielle will probably address this in her own presentation, is how I think we engage with that situation in Iran, how we engage with this political dynamic in Iran. And of course, it's not easy. Iran is never easy. But, nonetheless, it is there. We are not dealing with a monolith. And you'll find some very, very interesting views within the country itself. And we have to move away, as I think all of us have said, from really seeing Iran as Ahmadinejad alone. That's not to say, as I said, that he is not going to be around for a little longer. That's not to say that he's not a good spoiler and that he has a certain agenda and that it can be continued. But there are cracks. There are cracks, there are visible cracks, and it's a question of dealing with those. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Eloquent as always. And I think what you said at the end was very important about there being multiple voices in Iran. It would be wrong to read Iran as just Ahmadinejad. I'm actually going to talk a bit about the model of diplomacy that's being used by the West. And I'm actually going to question whether the way we're now working is effective, and in fact, if we're missing a trick. Not least because I don't think we sufficiently understand the mindsets of the Islamists and how they're thinking. I think a lot of our engagement is, at present, is from the American government, is from an ideological position, which is long distance and no contact. And it's as if we're guessing or imagining what the minds are of the Iranians. And of course, you explained how there are many minds, but how do we offer them something in which they would want to engage with? And I would say that the old methods of diplomacy, which are founded on a Hobbesian view of the world, which notions that people are ultimately self-seeking, power-hungry, and needing to be restrained, it's time for us to think about a different model, which is perhaps much more based on mutual self-interest and reciprocal needs of security. And I think what the West has, up until now, been able to think that we have sufficient power that we can set the agenda in terms of the negotiations. And one of the things that we are very clear about is that Iranian enrichment must be suspended for further negotiations. Well, as far as we're concerned, that's extremely reasonable. As far as the Iranians are concerned, they are saying we want to talk unconditionally. They also see it as one of their tricks in their pack for negotiation, and remembering they are very shrewd chess players. But I thought Hans Blick's words were interesting when he said it's illogical to ask Iran to suspend its enrichment program before diplomatic negotiations take place, because that's one of the things they want to negotiate about. So I would suggest, and I'm quite sure that the Bush administration are not listening at the moment, or let's hope that actually the very conditions of failure that we might see could make us have to think again and think about a different way of engagement. And I would say we actually need a different paradigm for engaging. I'm sure many of you are aware of the grand bargain that was actually put on the table in 2003. I mean, I know it's controversial as to exactly the terms of it. However, and it was also under the Khatami government, and things have changed since then. But in fact, I think what we need to do is quietly find out whether there is some kind of negotiation that addresses the security anxieties of all the parties involved in the conflict. And I think what we forget is Iran also has its own security concerns. It has nuclear Pakistan, it has nuclear India, it has nuclear Israel, it has the US on the Iran border, on the Iraqi border. And so what I would say, what would happen if we sat down and really said, what are the security concerns of all the parties involved? America's security concerns are clearly about the protection of Israel, a very legitimate concern. She needs to see stability in the Gulf, and her concern for seeing things quieten down in Iraq. So what are the options for opening something up that's much wider? I would say key to this is Israel in all this. And at the moment, and I spend quite a lot of time moving around in the Middle East, and a lot of time talking to Israeli colleagues who would, even amongst the left, amongst the doves, have a huge fear of Iran becoming nuclear. However, they are consumed, and it sort of stirred up a very deep existential anxiety in them that Iran's desire to become nuclear is entirely focused on them. And of course it has been made, the tension has been ratcheted up by the words of Ahmadinejad, talking about the myth of the Holocaust and talking about wishing to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. I mean, I know all that's been open to many interpretations. However, what I would say is some of this needs turning on its head. And in fact, both Iran and Israel, which will seem a sort of rather strange thing to say, and perhaps a little surprising, are actually natural allies. And it would be, if one could put on the table, what are the security concerns of all the parties involved here? And in fact, I mean, this would mean a very, very different kind of negotiation, and perhaps it would need to be done very quietly to begin with. But it would, for example, but there are shifts that we can see at the present. We know that that Saudi Arabia and Iran have been in conversation, and certainly one of the things I believe that might be very important in this very complex systemic analysis is to quietly find out whether Iran would actually, over time, support the Saudi Arabian initiative. And she's actually said, and it's on record, that any agreement that's acceptable to the Palestinians, that she will have to fall in behind. But that's not the kind of stuff that is out in the ether. What's around is all the stuff around the rhetoric and the platitudes and the fear. And if, in fact, one goes underneath it and starts saying, what are the real security anxieties of all the parties, which is a very, very different frame. And what one needs to do is to bring in all the regional players and to start from perhaps a more level playing field, because I think Iran is saying loud and clear that what she wants is more regional influence. Well, one might say, well, instead of taking a position of trying to isolate her, unless one thinks that's very tactically shrewd and is going to be effective, what would happen if we turned it round and said, well, instead of her playing a spoiler role, what would it look like if some of her concerns were addressed? And one might take the risk to say to her, well, perhaps you could have, instead of using Hezbollah and Hamas to cause bother, what would it look like if you bring them into the peace process? And this is no longer such a crazy idea, because Hamas have been making, I'm sure you're aware of the Mecca agreement, in which even Khalid Mashal has said this is an opportunity for peace in the region. And Hezbollah actually want quiet. They don't want a further attack. And this is based on my contact for having been in quiet talks with some of these groups, and it's not that it wouldn't be secret. But I think what we're talking about is a real shift in mindset. I think we're talking about the kind of boldness and imagination that actually challenges the current paradigm. And I suppose all I'd say is I hope people are listening. So thank you.
Professor Ansari, you spoke about how regionally Iran is seeing itself as more because of what other players are doing. But I wanted to ask you if we might be able to consolidate this position with the recent work of Ali Nasser in terms of the Shia revival. Do you see any sort of connection between what's going on with the Shias in the region, more political activism, and Iran?
Well, my view has been always that Iran sees the role of, in Iran in a broader sense, not just Ahmadinejad, and uses religion in a far more instrumentalist sense than I think some people would acknowledge. I think Iran's agenda is driven by a number of different ideological sort of determinants, and I think its nationalism is also quite important. Shiism, you have to bear in mind, in the Arab world is probably quite different now to Shiism in the Iranian world, and it's for the simple reason that, when you have labored under a religious government for 28 years, you tend to have a different view towards religion than to those sort of Shias in Iraq who have not, have basically labelled under a dictatorship for 30 or 40 years and are now just rediscovering, in a sense, their religious roots. So I tend to see, the sort of aspect of the Shia crescent or the Ark of Crisis or whatever as, in some ways, a convenient policy tool in the West, not necessarily something that reflects the realities on the ground in the Middle East as accurately as I think people would like it to be. And certainly while it does play a role in Iran, obviously Iran sees that as a means by which it can exercise its influence, I don't think you should draw a direct sort of almost monolithic relationship between sort of the Shias in Iran and the Shias elsewhere. I think that it's a useful tool, but there are other things that will determine Iran's behavior. And, Shias, as I said, will just as much enjoy killing each other as they will other, Sunnis. So, it's not this notion that we have this great sort of sectarian divide in the Middle East. I think it suits the political agenda of certain powers, particularly, of course, our moderate Arab friends. But I don't think it's an accurate reflection of what's going on the ground.
Of course, Israel and Iran were natural allies during the time of the Shah. That's because they had a common enemy. What would be the logic behind natural relationship at this point?
Yes, and maybe your question is what's in it for Iran? Because and it's interesting, it's probably pretty clear what is in it for Israel if she was open to there are people in Israel who talk like this, but there are also many hardliners who talk differently. When in 2003 what was quietly offered was signing up to the Beirut Declaration, what was on offer for Iran's real interest is the US, but the US will protect Israel's interest in terms of what she'll sign up to. Now, if on offer for Iran was security guarantees of non-interference, which they're very, very consumed by, if also unfreezing of all the assets, possibly joining up to the WTO, somehow becoming part of the family of nations, I think there could be lots in it for Iran that actually would be in her best interest.
Why through Israel?
Sorry?
Why through Israel? Why not the US?
No, absolutely. The negotiations wouldn't directly take place between Israel and Iran, because it's actually between Iran and the US, but it's Israel that has to be factored into it.
You can't do one without the other. I mean, basically, they've come to that conclusion themselves. I mean, you cannot. I think the Iranians have tried to do at periodic times to go direct to the US, but you can't do it. You know, one of the criteria that the US would say is recognition of the state of Israel. So you have to deal with that. And I think there are. I mean, I think there are sound geopolitical and cultural reasons why I think what Gabrielle says in the long term will probably happen. And you only have to look actually at the reaction to the death of the execution of Saddam Hussein to see actually where interests lie. I mean, the Iranians did not shed too many tears, I have to say, at the execution of Saddam Hussein, but they were very disappointed that some of their Arab allies did. And there was a lot of soul-searching going on in Iran about, whether we should be supporting Hamas in light of the fact that they think Saddam Hussein is an Arab martyr. I mean, we shouldn't again see there's a lot of things that are done sometimes for ideological reasons and sometimes for more realpolitik reasons. I wouldn't say that anything like this is going to happen soon, but there are clear indications, there are clear signs that there's a much more realist view towards, their relations with Israel. And, bear in mind that actually the Iranian Jewish diaspora is not small and it's quite influential.
I think it'd be a bit of a trap to talk about recognition. I think we would do better to go up for things like signing up to the Saudi initiative, because we can just get trapped in that. That's going to be a slower process. What you really want to see is a way that people find to coexist. It's a bit like Northern Ireland. The IRA and the Good Friday Agreement didn't actually go for recognising the British government. They actually still kept their greater dream, but we did have an end of violence.
Last question for this question. I'll use the mic. Is there an emotional barrier between Islamic nations and Israel? Sort of a question of orthodoxy that they can't get over, even if there's an interest in other respects?
No, I think it's a very important question, and I think the answer to that is yes. I spend a lot of time talking to Islamists, and I think we get trapped when we say go for it's necessary to recognize Israel, because just very deeply in their whole kind of set of beliefs, they are trapped in that at the moment. But I think they're trying to find ways round And that's why it will be a gradual process. And if you stick, and I think one of the mistakes again is around conditionality towards Hamas, that's a whole different subject. But if you say, if you do this, this and this, then we'll talk to you, then what you should do is start talking, because actually the Islamists are very interested in an end of violence. They need it more than anybody else.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to speak from the point of view of admittedly a long retired diplomat, but a working diplomat who did quite a lot of negotiation. And before that, I was a policy planner. And I'm trying to use those two experiences to deal with our present situation. And is it going to work? If it's not going to work, had we better do something about it? In that case, what had we better do about it? The first question is our present policy, that is the Western policy, which has now been very successfully produced as a unanimous Security Council resolution. It was a great achievement of the Western diplomats to keep all the countries, all 5 permanent members together, because Russia and China did not really want to go as far as they've gone. So we've got a unanimous Security Council resolution, but it is weak. And yet, in my submission, it is ineffective. My main point is that the present Western policy is probably not going to work. I'm not prepared to say that there is no chance that it will work. But I do claim that the probabilities that it will work are very low, and the consequences of it not working are very serious. On the second point, I mean principally that we are quite rapidly approaching the point where the West will have only 2 real options. One is a military option, which in my view would be a disaster. And the second is some weak diplomatic move which effectively allows the Iranians to do whatever they choose to do. I'm not sure what the Iranians will choose to do. I'm not totally convinced that they will rush to get a nuclear weapon. And even if they did rush, it would take about 5 years. They may not aim to get a nuclear weapon at the earliest possible moment. They may restrict themselves to getting into a position where they could go to a nuclear weapon. But I would regard that as a disaster, especially if they get the weapon. In my submission, Western policy is heading only to a choice of 2 disasters, either military action or standing so strongly against anything for the Iranians can claim as a success that in fact there's no agreement and they go ahead. I think that it can be reasonably said that the present Western policy was not stupid. It was quite reasonable to begin by asking for everything we would like. But there does come a point, and we've been on this track now for about 3 years, there does come a point when you really got to assess whether you're going to get it or not. And in fact, the more we've gone on with this policy, the further we are from actually persuading the Iranians or forcing the Iranians to accept it. Certainly, the pressures that will keep on ratcheting up do have an effect on the Iranians. Certainly, they don't like the second US carrier force arriving. Certainly they don't like the rather weak sanctions that the Security Council has imposed on them, on top of the sanctions that the US government has been imposing ever since 1980. But they can live with them. These pressures and sanctions are, in my view, simply not big enough. The carrots we're offering them are not negligible, but they're not very juicy. The sticks we're trying to beat them with, well, they're painful, but they're not painful enough to make them change their mind. So we, in my view, face very probably a defeat. We will not get what we're aiming for. Now, it's important to realize what it is exactly that we are aiming for. And what we say we're aiming for is what President Bush has said very clearly. I have to say that over the last 3 years there have been many statements of what the West is aiming for, but the clearest and probably the real one is that the President has said that there are 3 things that the Iranians must not be allowed to have. Number 1, no bomb. Right. We all agree with that. I don't actually know of any country, except conceivably Iran, and they say they're not aiming at a bomb, but I don't know of any country that wouldn't agree with that. Second point, no machinery that can make a bomb. Third point, no technology that can allow you to make the machinery that might make a bomb. Now, points 2 and 3 are getting to be a bit ridiculous because the Iranians already have the machinery, the so-called P1 centrifuges. They're pretty inefficient centrifuges. The Iranians haven't totally mastered how to make them work, but they are making, we keep on hearing about these 2 cascades, each of 164 centrifuges, which are in fact spinning. The Pakistanis who provided these P1 centrifuges in the first place made them work and produced a bomb. The Iranians can do the same. And I don't know of a single nuclear expert who thinks that they will not do it. Now, it's really down to engineering tricks. I mean, how to keep the centrifuges spinning continuously, how to ensure that the flow of the gas through the centrifuges is done in the most efficient way. They haven't got far to go before they can do what they please. I said this morning that they might do it next week. One of our expert colleagues said, well, they may have done it last week. I don't know. Nobody knows. The Iranians don't know. Nobody knows when they're going to achieve it. All we know is that if they go on long enough, they will achieve it. And we have, I think, been rather odd in running a policy which has given them now just over 12 months free run at doing this perfectly legally. There's nothing illegal in what the Iranians have been doing in the experimenting with their centrifuges, and it's all been examined by the IEA, and we know exactly what they've been doing. Well, I don't think it's very clever of us to have given them 12 months, and now we're going to go on giving them time, and as soon as they do it, then we've lost. Now, and at that point, then a lot of Iranians are going to say, well, we've won. Why do we need to compromise? And the more we go on talking about battle groups and so on, the more we convince the Iranians that, well, perhaps we do need a deterrent. Basically, a deterrent against the United States. So my main submission is that it would be prudent for us to change course. I'm not saying change our objective. I think we should maintain our objective of no bomb, but we should compromise a bit on saying on the objective of no machinery and no technology, because as I've tried to explain, we've really lost that already, but not quite totally. We should make a compromise, and many people have made proposals for compromise. I'll just mention two, because they're the two which I think are most likely to work. One of them is what I call the pilot plant proposal, which is that there should be an agreement whereby the number of centrifuges, which is the crucial piece of material, the number of centrifuges the Iranians agree to limit themselves to is whatever number they have at that time. They've now got 2 lots of 164. Well, you know, they're racing to produce more. So we cap it at whatever that number is, provided it doesn't go over about 1,000. After that, it becomes more problematic, because the type of centrifuge they've got, with 1,000 of those, it would take them over a year, even if they work brilliantly, to get enough material for one bomb. So they're poor machines. The advantage about an agreement capping the number is that it would meet the bottom line on both sides. It would mean that the Iranians could say that they were having enrichment on Iranian soil, which is their bottom line, in my view. Our bottom line is no bomb. Well, effectively, it would be very difficult to make a bomb out of a few hundred of those P1 centrifuges. The other, there are two problems about the pilot plant route. One is, how long would it last? The Iranians are not going to agree that it should be permanent. The other is, it's a wonderful cover for a clandestine operation. I'm not going to explain exactly why, because I don't have time, but it is, if the Iranians wanted to run a clandestine operation, in other words, have another lot of centrifuges secretly elsewhere, not inspected by the IEA, a pilot plant would be rather a good way, a good cover for it. The second scheme that we might put forward, if we were going to compromise with the Iranians, is what I call a multilateral enrichment plant. It's quite complicated. It differs from the pilot plant in that it is a permanent solution, not a temporary one. Its basis is that the Iranians no longer own nationally any element that would go into the enrichment process. So it's not just the centrifuges, it's all the other things that back them up. Belong not, as I say, nationally to the Iranians in the future, but to a multilateral commercial company. To make it as simple as possible, I mean, the share owners in this company would be governments. And I would suggest we started with 4 governments, which would be the Iranians and then the 3 Europeans, the Germans, French, and British. So that there would be nothing that the Iranians owned outright, which could be used to make a weapon. Now, and this would be a very difficult scheme under which to run a clandestine operation, because the daily work of the Iranians involved in it and the Europeans involved in it would mean that the Europeans would know exactly who the Iranians were and what they were doing. And the Iranians would be nuts to agree to this if they intended to run a clandestine operation. However, there is a potential big objection, and that is that this plant and all the facilities that back it up would be in Iran. In fact, they'd be what the Iranians have already spent the money on. They would also involve better centrifuges. And this, all this could be expropriated. The Iranians could send the army in and seize this material, and if they did, it would take them a few months from then to go on to getting material for a weapon, but they could do it reasonably soon. But I don't think it's likely. I mean, why enter into this agreement, which, if they broke it, would mean expropriating the property of three rather powerful governments, and would actually tantamount to announcing that they were going for a nuclear weapon. And then they would be very vulnerable for the several months that it would take between the expropriation and the time they could get a weapon. So, I believe we should decide to change course. I recommend one of these two changes, and I recommend we do it quickly, because time is not on our side. I conclude by saying that if we can't do this, then perhaps we should think of what we've been calling a grand bargain. And Gabrielle was talking about some of the elements in it. As a practicing diplomat, I find it unattractive because there are so many moving parts to make work simultaneously in a grand bargain that it becomes complicated. And in fact, we have the rather strange situation that the US government and the Iranian government both prefer to solve the nuclear question separately. But if it's not possible to do that, I do think a grand bargain could be done, but it would require tremendous leadership, and I don't see the leadership anywhere around for this purpose. And it would require what Gabrielle called changing people's mindsets. And that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes,
yeah, why the solution of denuclearize the entire region is not even considered?
It would be a splendid solution, and all our governments have frequently said that they would like this solution, but nobody thinks it's practical. And the reason it isn't believed to be practical at the moment is because although the government of Israel is very careful to maintain ambiguity, nobody doubts that they've got a very considerable arsenal, probably at least 200 nuclear weapons. They're not going to give it up unless they get something very good. And the Arabs and the Iranians are certainly not going to enter into a nuclear-free zone. They're not going to give up their abilities. They claim their rights to go the same way as Israel, unless they get something very good. Now, I would love to see at the end of it all that the whole Middle East was a nuclear-free zone. And this is, of course, part of what one aim at in the so-called grand bargain. But, I repeat, it's very difficult to get there.
I would like to follow up on that question. If you cannot have a nuclear-free zone, and obviously it was attempted in other parts of the world, particularly India, Pakistan, North Korea, etc. And with the number of nuclear weapons that Israel has, if the Iranians did in fact have a bomb, wouldn't you then have a situation of mutually assured destruction? And if you look at India and Pakistan, now that they are both nuclear powers, their situation seems to have been downgraded in terms of the likelihood of a severe military incident. And if you look at North Korea, now that it has nuclear weapons, it's entered into negotiations that seem, hopefully, to be moving towards some sort of resolution. If you cannot get a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, which you can't, there's no question that the Israelis will not participate in giving up their weapons, how can you ask the Iranians or other Middle Eastern countries not to try and have their own weapons, especially now that the United States has moved its nuclear weapons into fleets surrounding the area? It seems to be that although Bush's three
I know,
doesn't work, at least the second, as you've indicated, number 2 and number 3 are completely off the table at this point. I would suggest that number 1 is off the table, and that if you have the confrontation between two nuclear powers, I think you can say historically, although the tension may remain, the likelihood of a serious nuclear confrontation reduces.
Right. Well, you're asking a very fundamental question, which, of course, has been endlessly debated in governments, internationally, and academically. And there is a group of people, very respectable, who hold your view. The ministers of the whole, James will bear me out, I think there's a whole school, but it's a very much a minority school. Why did I say that it would be a disaster for Iran to get nuclear weapons? 2 reasons. One is because they might actually get used somehow or other, deliberately or accidentally, with horrible results. But the other reason is that I am strongly of the majority school, which believes that we're all safer if there are no more countries with nuclear weapons. And we had a successful non-proliferation regime from 1968, when the non-proliferation treaty was signed, until India and Pakistan exploded their tests in 1998. Of course, there was Israel. I'm going to leave that aside. In my view, I should have made clear earlier that I'm speaking only for myself. I'm not speaking for anybody else, and certainly not for my government. But in my view, it is still possible to have an effective non-proliferation regime, although it has been eroded by India, Pakistan, then in my view, by the US-Indian agreement, which has gone through as far as the US government procedures are concerned, but there are still some hurdles. I think that's dangerous. I think it's undermining non-proliferation and leading to an arms race. In fact, the arms race is started and going on already. North Korea, bad. This agreement that you talk about could have been had 5 years ago, and if so, then the North Koreans wouldn't have exploded their nuclear bomb, and they wouldn't have all the plutonium they've now got. If Iran goes nuclear, militarily nuclear, it's a big blow additionally on top of this, and the whole regime is unraveling. And if Iran goes, who is to say what Egypt will do, what Saudi Arabia will do, what Turkey will do, what other people will do? So it's a fundamental decision. Are you better off to have every pair of antagonists, each with nuclear weapons, or are you better off to have them all say no? I think I should stop there. I'm very tempted to go on to talk about India and Pakistan and what I did, but I think this is probably enough, because aren't we running out of time?
Would you still take one question?
Yes?
Go ahead. Any other questions?
If there's no more questions, could you speak about India and Pakistan and the failure of the Bush leadership that has led to a situation that approves clear violations of what have been considered? And I guess my criticism of your position is that the Bush administration's failure to deal with North Korea 5 years ago has resulted in what we have now. The Bush administration's positive feelings towards India and what they're doing has led to what may in fact be an arms race. I would suggest that the Bush's failure of leadership is what makes the current policy, their policy, the Bush policy with Iran, absolutely unworkable. And that's something, in terms of the European community or the UN, has to simply step forward and say that this project is not working and look for other solutions. And could you speak to India and Pakistan as an example?
Well, let me take, you were raising really rather a lot of big questions, and I certainly don't have time to deal with all of them. But I will just deal with your original point, I mean, which was very germane to what I was trying to say. I mean, you were making the point, I think, that now that India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons, are they not in a mutually deterrent situation, and that the chances of a war have declined? And people who make this argument, and there are quite a lot, including the Indians and the Pakistanis, it's one of the few things they agree on, as Bob would testify, say that it also reduces the likelihood of war. I think you've got to go back for a moment to the Cold War at McNamara. We were damned lucky to get through the Cold War without any nuclear use. And we're even, now that the historians are able to go into the files, now that we're able to talk to the Soviets, we're staggering at how lucky we were and how close we came. So, I mean, that would have, most of us sitting here today wouldn't be here if things had gone a little wrong or we had been a little less lucky. Now, India and Pakistan, I would have said for about 5 years, the most likely place in the world for there to be a nuclear war was in the subcontinent, India, Pakistan. But that is not so true now for exactly the reason you mentioned. They came to the brink of war, and I think James might agree with me on this. They came to the brink of war in May, where am I, 2002. May, June 2002.
The Indian kick-off date was June 15th.
It jolly nearly happened. Pakistan is a very unstable country. I'm not prepared to say it won't happen again. And now I think my taxi must be there.
That was a very nice. Well, that prepares the way for a strategic analysis of the Iran crisis by somebody who has been involved in policy planning with Downing Street. And I'm really delighted that Professor James Gow is spending some time with us. James, go ahead.
There's a bullet coming up. You're hiding again. You're hiding again. Is that? Well, I should issue a major disclaimer first of all, because I wouldn't recognize any claim to be involved in policy planning in Downing Street. I'm trying.
Move it towards you. Closer. Move it closer.
I could just leave. Make it easier for everybody. Well, I guess you got the disclaimer. It's a little bit strange to be left here alone at the end of all of this. Not only because it's weird in itself, but also because I'm left at the end in a way to establish the context for some of the discussion that's gone before. Life's like that sometimes. Practicalities override logic and sense. So listen to what I have to say for a couple of minutes and then let it read back through some of the other things that you've heard. We're in a situation at the moment where two trains are on the same track heading towards a major crash, which I'm happy to say I've been wrong about, to the extent that I expected it to come this summer, but I still anticipate that it will come somewhere in the next 15 months, and likely sooner than not. The two trains, the United States on one side and Iran on the other. It's necessary to understand that strategically, and I've spent a little bit of time over the past 2 days trying to educate one or two people about strategy, involves many things, but crucially involves, in good old Clausewitzian terms, an interplay of reason, chance, and passion. And the passion is such an enormous component in understanding what we're dealing with, and the power that it gives to these two trains on one track. That's what you need to take and go back into some other parts of this discussion. The US, because of an understandable, clear, rational, strategic priority, has had a consistent position from the mid-1970s onwards that Iran will not be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapons capability. The reasons for that shouldn't be too difficult to discern. Following the Iranian Revolution, following the hostage crisis, following Iranian-backed campaigns of insurgent terror in a number of countries, including France in the 1980s, the Iranians don't come with good credentials. They have a clear program of antagonism to the United States in particular, to the West in general. In one case, trying to explain this to somebody who said, well, why shouldn't Iran be allowed to have a nuclear weapon? I said, Hezbollah. The person went, oh. And I think one of the things that John didn't get onto before in terms of the proliferation question is, if Iran acquires this capability, not only what will Iran do with it as a state actor, but what are the implications for further proliferation, and in particular to a range of non-state actors, of which Hezbollah would be first in line, but a range of others out there. So the US has a long-standing position on non-proliferation, shared by other Western countries, which is, this is too important if you want to protect yourselves and maintain the strategic high ground, to allow others the possibility, and especially those who have shown themselves to have a program of outright hostility. And I think it's important to understand that question. The Bush administration has got a lot of critics, and there are many people I've come across in discussion who see this as a question of the Bush administration. I would very strongly counsel that this is a consistent policy handed down from one administration to another over 30 years, and that had there been a Kerry administration, it would have been taking exactly the same approach. The difficulty is that for any administration, they're on a hiding to nothing, because there are few alternatives, if any, and Gabrielle was alluding to the idea of some routes we might take. John was raising some others. Frankly, I remain sceptical that either of those perspectives in themselves is going to be enough to escape this situation. But we're in a situation where the strategic logic from the US perspective, underpinned by passion in the United States, going back 25, 30 years in the relations with Iran, it means that if Iran is going to head towards a nuclear weapons capability, the US will take the judgment that it will have to do something to prevent that happening. The other options seem limited. That leads in the direction of a military option. The military option, it's well recognized, is enormously difficult, is unlikely to be decisively effective forever, would only be about stopping what's going on now, or some of it, if they were lucky, if it all worked out, and creating more time. So it's not a particularly rosy picture if you look at it in that direction. Let's look to the other side of this. Iran, with the revolution, also put itself into a form of isolation. Iran, in the last few years, strategically, has been adept in moving forward not only on the nuclear weapons question and moving into a position where John said it would take 5 years. There are other prognoses which suggest 18 months, yet others which say 11. One bizarre comment I heard in recent days said, well, if it came to military action, then they would get the weapon within 6 months, which kind of said if they can do it in 6 months in a crisis under fire, why couldn't they do it sooner? The real answer to this is that nobody knows enough about Iran and about Iran's intentions and about its capabilities, although there are plenty of indications that those intentions are to acquire a military capability, and that won't necessarily be for the purposes simply of building up a mutually assured destruction deterrence relationship with others. But Iran's position on nuclear weapons, one of the things Ali said about we shouldn't focus only on Ahmadinejad is crucial in this. Everybody across the political spectrum in Iran, just about, we understand, agrees that Iran, as a great historic, culturally important country, is entitled, just as a mark of its importance, to be able to acquire a nuclear weapons capability. There is a great passion and a pride on the Iranian side, leaving aside any other machinations about how and why these things might be used. That means Iran presumably has no intention or no possibility simply of turning around and saying, okay, we won't have nuclear weapons after all. We were just joking. An enormously difficult situation. Two policies, as far as we can tell, mutually exclusive, heading towards each other with potentially catastrophic outcomes, which I won't go into because there are too many different dimensions. Complicated by Iranian and US engagement in Iraq and the Cold War, or shall we say shadow proxy war that's been going on there as well, with Iranian troops and Iranian proxies, leading to a situation, and making the whole picture even more dangerous, leading to a picture where only something enormously radical, bold, transformative can get anybody out of something they're locked into, which I would fairly safely say nobody actually wants to happen. But nobody knows how they can get out of it. There's no realistic probability of any US administration that I can see turning around and saying, okay, it doesn't matter after all. Let Iran have a nuclear weapon. We'll forget about the past. We'll forget about the hostages. We'll forget about the terrorism across the Middle East and in France. And there's no prospect of seeing Iran turning around and saying, it doesn't matter to us. we're going to give up. What can change this? We've been, in our meetings, privately batting ideas about. A couple of these have come forward. Frankly and dismally, I shall conclude by saying there's a need for something radical, transformative, bold. Maybe it's a miracle, maybe it's a natural disaster, maybe it's something of genius-like insight, but I see no prospects, and I don't know if there's any point taking any questions after that. You should just go away and cry.
Well, perhaps there was a reason why you spoke at the end, because it's hopeful note. If there are any questions, we would be willing to take them. We, meaning Ambassador Finn, myself, and Professor Gao. Go ahead.
Yes, I heard recently that Iran was going to implement gasoline rationing. I've also read where the oil production capability is about to decline drastically in the near future. And I was wondering, I also had heard that Vladimir Putin had discussed, this was several months ago, the possibility of a natural gas cartel. I wonder if you could comment on what role Russia might play at all in this foreign policy?
Well, first, this is why we should have gone in a different order, because Ali would be a far better placed person to answer than I am. And maybe Ambassador Finn, with his Russian dimensions, will come in. But I mean, Russia was giving support to Iran in developing some of its technology. That support has been cut off and has been withdrawn. What, if I've understood your intention in the question, what might Russia do to help transform this situation? I suspect next to nothing. But if there is if you have a secret bright idea lurking in the back of your head, or rushing to get out about the role that Russia might play to transform this, I think all ideas gratefully received,
Robert,
all around. But I think Russia is locked into a situation where it has its own questions with the West. We're back in a Cold War with Moscow, not the same Cold War, not quite as frightening and threatening for now, but in various places this is playing out. And I think Russia has its own concerns about Iran. Russia would certainly not want to see Iran become a military nuclear power, but at the same time, I suspect it would rather play with the idea of Iran's going in that direction rather than necessarily assisting to give something to help get Washington or the West out of the mess.
Well, actually, I'm glad this came up, because the one thing I was going to say is that I'm not a negotiator like Sir John. I'm a very practical diplomat who spent most of my career in fairly dangerous places trying to solve very ugly problems. And I think that, in fact, there is still some room for movement. I agree with what you say about Russia. Russia doesn't want Iran to become a nuclear power. Russia stands to benefit, actually, if the United States and Iran engage in military action, because I could see the Persian Gulf getting plugged up, and then it would only be Russia who could supply energy to Western Europe, which would make them all very happy indeed. At the same time, I don't think Russia wants that to happen. And I suggested in our conversations earlier that one way to get around this problem is to try to force the Iranians to act on what they say, and to perhaps have some kind of coalition of neighboring countries who have it in their very, very important self-interest to avoid having a problem in Iran. Countries such as Kazakhstan, which has given up its nuclear weapons, Turkey, obviously a prime target for Iranian anger, and perhaps Ukraine, and perhaps Russia, and perhaps China, to have some people who are not emotionally involved in this argument. And you very, very rightly point out all the factors that make the American position much more densely focused than it might otherwise be. People who can stand back a little and look at the situation, perhaps it's time for those people to come in. In our private discussion, so many speakers brought up the fact that America has not come to a position where it is saying in any of its foreign policy issues that this isn't working out, we're not doing the right thing, we need some help here. That's something that has to happen. And I think if those things happen, and I see in American public opinion, we're not going as blindly into this question about Iraq as we did with Iran as we did with Iraq. People have learned some very bitter lessons, and people both within and without the government are questioning just what it is that the government is doing and why it is doing what it is doing. So I think there is room for play. And I think we may have two trains, but I'm not sure that they're actually on the same track going towards one another. I think they might be on two tracks.
Maybe one answer to your gas liquefaction technology. As John Thomson mentioned before, rightly, there were and have been major sanctions on Iranian economy in the last 20 years, really. And first of all, we are, of course, all aware that Iran does indeed sit on the second largest world reserve for natural gas and oil, but the rationing and the price increase of petroleum, of gasoline, is indeed a result of the biting sanctions for the refining process. Iran has entered into a special relationship in the last couple of years as it concerns energy supply, long-term energy supply, with China and with India. I call this the new phenomenon of the Silk Road, the inverse Silk Road phenomenon. In the past, we tried to export raw materials from Asia and exchange it with product goods, now, or semi-finished goods. Now it's the other way around. Iran is very cognizant of this situation, and so is China, because it could permit China, whose economy, as we all know, is on a tremendous upward swing, a continuum in energy supply on the land way, barring shipping. And it also means something else. China and Russia and the surroundings have developed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is primarily a trade and semi-political organization which begins more and more to venture out, as Albert Hirschman and others have said for long, economic and industrial power commensurate with strategic relevance in the long run. Iran and Afghanistan have now observer status in this organization. There is a clear great power game going on. Gas liquefaction technology is instrumental to ship high quantities of gasoline in pipelines. So this is a technology of highest strategic preeminence. Ali Ansari would tell you that yes, indeed, some of these sanctions bite. Yes, indeed, on the daily life, Iranians today have to pay much more for tomatoes and basic goods, as he hinted, because of this new cash flow, which obviously has inflationary ramifications for the economy. The question is how long it takes till it bites so much that it changes the leadership. And he, in our discussion, brought up an interesting phenomenon. He said, we talk about regime change or regime transformation. It's neither the one nor the other. It's a change of persona. It's getting rid of Ahmadinejad. It's replacing, perhaps by Allah's will, a apparently sick Khamenei, who really is Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, and to whom even Ahmadinejad has a subordinate relationship. Whether these sanctions, which begin to bite, are able to bring about the result which we all confronted with this time clocking. The time is clocking. There is an absolute deadline. And the absolute deadline is, and I fully agree with James, even if it's unfortunate that one has to think about the consequences, it is very clear that from the strategic perspective of two key actors in the Iran crisis, Iran is not supposed to have nuclear weapons capability. The two are the United States of America, with or without the Bush administration, and finding itself in an electoral campaign for new presidential leadership, and the State of Israel. Having seen the limits of its own military power last summer, feeling somewhere that the government is weakened, having a military organization which is especially an air force, which strives to get the just recognition which it had lost last summer for the first time in the history of IDF air forces. And having also a potential leadership crisis, where Bibi Netanyahu speaks a totally different language than Olmert. But even Olmert stated a couple of weeks ago, I rather pay $100 per barrel of oil than have a nuclear-capable Iran. The question is whether we do find an alternative, I don't want to call it a third way, but an alternative which bites quickly, effectively, and influences the perspective and perception in the highest echelons of the leadership in both states. One thing is clear, neither London nor Washington want Israel to find themselves forced to undertake what they did in 1981 against the Iraqi nuclear reactor. The potential damages and fallout of such a situation would be utterly devastating for the region, for the international community, and for the relationship between Islamic and non-Islamic world. I have published somewhere else just last week. The problem is currently that the United States of America, the Bush administration, has created a three-pronged strategic trap situation for Iran. Number one, the trap to find a smoking gun with the nuclear issue. To find that Iran has ventured to be in a situation where it could break out quickly and develop the bomb. As it was said in one of these days now, they may have the technology tomorrow, or they may just got it yesterday. Second trap, the Bush administration tried to demonstrate 3 weeks ago on Monday, you may remember the New York Times articles. The finding of supposedly Iranian weapon systems in Iraq, meaning that we have hundreds of American servicemen and servicewomen who fell casualty to these new centered forced explosive devices. And in this second part, there's also the finding of Austrian sniper rifles in Iran. I have been really personally engaged in this. There is no proof about this. Nobody could produce any sniper rifle. And you could prove the serial numbers easily. There was no sniper rifle nowhere. And what is the third trap? Iranian support to Hezbollah and terrorism against Israel. Any of these traps could permit the President of the United States to order immediate act of defense, permissible under the War Powers Act, which gives him 90 days, and you only need a week or 2 or 3 to take the necessary ramifications, necessary action to take care of this threat. The problem is, of course, or the fortunate thing is, of course, that some in the American government feel that we still should try to make the extra step. Doesn't this sound familiar? To go the extra mile and to test out diplomatic moves. The first of this, and it was announced by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in a hearing 12 days ago, precisely at the time when Vice President Dick Cheney was at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. The problem is, of course, that the first part of this meeting, which took place amongst the regional actors around Iraq this weekend, was not that good, and we discussed actually en detail that it would be really important now for the situation in the region that the next meeting is on ministerial level, on the level of secretaries. I venture to say, and I really have to say, when 3 weeks ago, before there was this attempt to produce evidence that Iran is involved in Iraq, I was very worried that we would really head on totally in this way, as James Gow has so eloquently produced before. I feel a bit more hopeful now, provided that this meeting in April is indeed on ministerial level, whether in Baghdad or in Istanbul or wherever. However, if any event, any discovery of a smoking gun, or God forbid, any major loss of American servicemen or women, which could be traced back to some supposedly Iranian involvement, happens in the near future, any of these 3 triggers, which I mentioned before, could be launched. My final word, this president, as any president, knows he's going out of office, but he is also concerned to go out of office and about his status in history. And I think he is well aware that if the disaster of Iraq is the way how he is judged in history, it will not be very appealing. There is this other major pressure, which is so typically in the history of international diplomacy, that it leads to sudden outbursts of violence. There is this pressure of perception and this sudden development of crisis, accidental wars we call it. And the question is whether these next 12 months can be overcome without that any of these triggers get launched.